There's a skill in leadership that almost never appears on a dashboard. It isn't legislation or audit scores or how great your policies and your procedures are, but it is something that's often the difference between a near miss and a serious incident. Today, I'm talking about emotional intelligence. Now, before you get ahead of me and you think, well, that all sounds a little bit soft, let me actually explain why it isn't. Now, most business failures, most safety failures don't happen because someone didn't know what they were doing, they didn't know the rule. They happen when people are under pressure, maybe when production is behind, or maybe tempers are a little bit short, when someone perhaps feels exposed or a colleague hesitates. In those moments, it isn't the technical knowledge that decides what's going to happen next. It's the human behavior. It's not usually a lack of procedure that causes the problem. It's what's happening in the room when the pressure rises. Do we rush a discussion? Do we shut down a challenge? Do we defend our position instead of examining it? And that's where the real decision is made. And that's not technical, is it? That's behavioral. We've built this safety industry profession as a technical discipline with hazard identification and risk assessments and control measures and compliance audits. And yes, that is absolutely all essential. But systems don't usually fail because someone forgot the legislation. They fail in conversations. They fail in moments where someone hesitates and doesn't speak up. They fail when a challenge is interpreted as a criticism. They fail perhaps when pressure outweighs judgment. Those are all emotional moments. So let's think of something very ordinary. Let's think of an ordinary situation. A supervisor knows isolation is required before maintenance can be carried out, but production is falling behind. We've got a client that's waiting, a team that's tired, and senior leadership have been emphasizing delivery targets. Now, technically, the procedure is very clear, but emotionally, that pressure is real. So what's going to decide it? It's not the knowledge, that's already there. What decides it is whether the team are willing to absorb the consequences of stopping, maybe the awkward conversation, the delay, the performance impact. And that is where judgment lives. Most safety incidents have a moment before, a moment where something feels slightly off. There's maybe a flicker of doubt or a raised eyebrow, maybe even a quiet hesitation. Now, emotionally intelligent professionals notice those moments. They don't bulldoze past them. They will pause and ask questions and explore. However, if we perhaps had somebody who was less emotionally aware, those leaders might override those moments. They might fill the silence. They might speed up the discussion. They might interpret the doubt as resistance. And then that moment, that opportunity we had to make a change, well, that passes. And this is where those signals, those weak signals, that's where they die. Now, reading a room is an essential skill. You walk into a meeting, the slides are looking great, the metrics are steady, but something's feeling not quite right. There are perhaps fewer people speaking. Questions are shorter. Eye contact drops when certain issues arise. I'm sure you're thinking of times when that has happened to you. But that is data. You don't find that data in a report, but it's real. Emotionally intelligent leaders, they treat that atmosphere as information. They notice when the tone shifts. They notice who isn't speaking. They notice when a challenge disappears, because in any environment, in any business environment, silence is rarely neutral. Now, stress, that does change the brain. Under stress, the brain narrows. We become more reactive and less reflective. We're more protective. We have this prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for judgment and regulation. and that becomes a little bit less dominant. So it means that people take shortcuts much more easily. They justify their actions much more quickly. They defend their actions or thinking much more strongly, and they listen less carefully. And if we don't understand that, we perhaps mislabel behavior. Maybe we think that someone is careless when actually they're just overloaded, or we think someone's being obstructive when maybe they're just anxious. You think silence maybe means agreement, when actually it perhaps means fear. Now, emotional intelligence is the ability to interpret behavior accurately under pressure. That is what's going to prevent the misjudgment. And misjudgment, well, that's often the seed for escalation. Now, a real scenario I worked in with an organization, they had a serious incident. And when we analyzed the chain of events, there wasn't anything obvious that was missing. Procedures, they were in place. Training had been completed. Documentation, well, that was current, all was good. The failure hadn't actually happened on the shop floor. It had actually happened in a meeting, and it was a fairly ordinary one at that. The slides had been prevented and timelines discussed. The pressures of delivery had been acknowledged, but partway through, a junior engineer had raised a concern, not dramatically or emotionally, very carefully, in fact. They'd noticed something in the system that just didn't sit quite right. A vulnerability that, in the right conditions, had the potential to escalate. Now, the senior manager who was chairing that meeting was under, at that time, extreme time pressure. They had competing priorities. There were commercial deadlines, a sense that the conversation needed to be moved forward. The response wasn't aggressive, but there wasn't any shouting. It was perhaps a little bit sharper than usual, or it could have been interpreted as slightly dismissive. Something along the lines as, well, we've operated like this before, or let's not overcomplicate it, or even a throwaway comment of, we'll monitor it. But one of those comments was enough. The tone of the room shifted. The engineer, well, they stopped pushing. Others who may have had similar concerns, they stayed quiet. The issue was reframed. It wasn't reframed as a risk, but a manageable irritation. So the meeting moves on. No policy has been breached, no rule has been ignored, but in that little moment, something important changed. Now, weeks later, that same vulnerability contributed to a serious operational event. When it was investigated, yes, the documentation was in place. Yes, the procedures were correct and the training records, they were complete. But what had failed wasn't the system on paper. It was the emotional climate in that room. It was the subtle signal that challenging upwards carries friction. And that isn't something you can fix by adding another checklist. Now, here's some uncomfortable truths. And it wouldn't be one of our discussions, would it, if there wasn't something uncomfortable in there? But most professionals are trained in knowledge. They learn legislation, they learn process, they learn compliance frameworks, but very few are deliberately trained in managing defensive reactions or influencing senior stakeholders. They're not trained necessarily in challenging upwards without escalation or even recognizing emotional shutdown in a room. Those are the moments that define safety resilience. Yes, passing an exam proves knowledge, but it doesn't automatically build emotional regulation. It doesn't teach you how to remain calm when challenged. It doesn't teach you how to slow a heated conversation without losing authority. That's capability. And capability must be developed. If you're in a senior role, it is worth remembering that your responses do carry weight. Not because people are fragile, but because people are perceptive. When someone brings a concern, it's the way we respond, even subtly. Well, that response is going to influence what happens next, whether we give a pause, a change in tone, a quick shift towards delivery or pressure or tense up slightly. None of it's horrendously dramatic, but it does shape the room. And over time, it's going to shape what's being raised and what isn't. Leaders who don't understand this are in a bit of a tricky position, but those who do understand it, they create space for conversations. They're curious before they're corrective. Not because it sounds good in theory, but it's just keeping the information flowing. And without wanting to sound cheesy, information flow is resilience. Now, empathy is often misunderstood. It's not agreement, it's understanding. When someone cuts a corner, instead of asking, why did you ignore the rule? We should be asking, well, what pressure are you under? Because that question reveals the system strain, which is where risk is going to build. If we ignore emotional drivers, well, we only ever address the symptoms. But if we understand them, we address the causes. So let's make it a little bit personal then. So when you are challenged, what happens internally? What do you feel? Do you feel defensive or embarrassed or exposed? I think I recognize both of those, but what do you do with that feeling? When something feels uncomfortable, it's easy to become more certain, not more curious. It's easy to explain our position rather than explore it. We become defensive and we can find ourselves closing a discussion rather than widening it up. And most of the time, we don't even realize we're doing it. But the ability to notice that shift and then choose a different response, well, that's a significant skill. So let's make it practical. When incidents happen, the consequences, they're not abstract. They may be financial, reputational, they might disrupt operations, they could affect confidence both internally and externally. But when we trace them back, they rarely begin with someone not knowing the rule. More often, as we've said earlier, they begin much earlier. They begin in that meeting where a doubt wasn't explored, or in a conversation where challenge was softened, or perhaps in a moment where someone felt it was easier not to push. It's in those moments, and they feel very small at the time, but they're where the cost begins to accumulate. The ability to manage those moments well, by well, I mean managing it before anything escalates, well, that's going to be commercially protective too, because prevention at that stage is far less expensive than intervention after the fact. And again, that's where this emotional intelligence is really earning its place. Now, can it be developed, I hear you ask? And yes, absolutely, of course. It's not personality, it's not fixed, but it can be strengthened through having structured reflection, by getting feedback and not being closed off to that. Maybe by having scenario-based discussion, we can perhaps strengthen it through exposure to challenge in learning environments, or we could have deliberate practice in simulations. If I think about the strongest professionals that I've worked with, what stands out isn't their technical knowledge, it's how they operate in those difficult moments. They understand the regulations, of course they do, but they also understand the commercial environment that they're working in. And when a conversation becomes tense, they don't rush it or avoid it. They stay steady. They ask better questions and make it easier for people to speak honestly. That combination, that technical credibility and commercial awareness and emotional steadiness, is what is making them effective. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that technical strength on its own isn't what prevents incidents. It matters, of course it does. But when pressure rises, what really shapes outcomes is how people behave and how, as leaders, we respond. The professionals who make the biggest difference aren't just knowledgeable, they're steady. They notice when a room tightens, they sense when something hasn't quite been said, and they create enough space for it to surface. So perhaps the better question isn't whether your systems are robust, but what happens to your conversations when things become uncomfortable? Do they expand or do they contract? Because that tells you a great deal about how resilient your system really is.